Welcome to Fear Street. My house was built in 1904. It's a single-family home with a wood frame setting on a concrete block foundation. I've been living here for about 12 years, and of all the weird things that my siblings and me have seen and heard in this house, one event stands out. This happened to my brother. It was about 10 years ago. My brother and his best friends had started a garage band playing mostly Spanish rock. His friends could only get together on Sunday afternoons. They'd practice into the early evening and call it quits by 8 p.m. This was about the time I usually got home from work and went to bed, because I worked the graveyard shift. It was late fall, so the days were getting shorter, and they had just finished a long session and decided to head out to someone else's house. My brother handed his car keys to his buddy so they could load up the equipment. Everyone had left the basement and was waiting outside my brother's truck for him. My brother was walking up the back stairs when he remembered that he had left his pancakes in a to-go container that was sitting on a speaker in the basement. He made the decision to go back and get it. Now, the basement's not clean with full sight lines. There had been partitions made, and the boiler and main heating unit are right smack in the middle. So after my brother walks back, he's about to retrieve his food container when, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. It was a shadowy figure, right in his peripheral vision. This feeling of dread and uneasiness washed over him. We'd been taught that if you're in the presence of a spirit or ghost and you felt a bad vibe, say a quick prayer, but my brother was so scared he just got the hell out of there. He started to walk to the back of the basement and briskly up the stairs, closing doors and turning off lights as he was walking out. The last light switch is on the opposite side of the front door, and luckily the door was open and the night from the street lamp was flooding into the living room with its amber light. My brother said he had felt something at his back, but at no point did he turn around. As he flicked the last switch, the living room went dark, as did the rest of the house. As he stepped out, he pulled on the door, closing it behind him. Still holding his food container in one hand, he ran down the porch steps. He walked towards the front gate. Our house is far from the main street, essentially having a large front yard but no rear garage. As he closed the gap between himself and his friend-laden truck, he kind of smiled and thought things over in his head, mad at himself for freaking out when there was no reason. He climbed into the driver's side of the truck, putting on his seatbelt and getting ready to pull out of the parking lot when one of his friends asked, "Hey, wait, what about your brother? Isn't he coming with us?" My brother answered, "What do you mean? He went to work early tonight. He's already gone. You see his car anywhere?" He then asked, "So then, who was walking behind you when you were leaving the house?" One night when I was 10, I was woken up by my bedroom door opening, followed by someone sitting on my bed. I felt my leg grazed and the bed sink under a person's weight. Thinking it was my mom, I opened my eyes to see an eyeless boy. He had black, empty eye sockets. He was about my age and sitting at the foot of my bed. He extended his hand and in it was a little box. I was startled, but I reached out. He pulled back. I reached again and said, "Give it." Then I blinked, and when I reopened my eyes, he was gone. But the imprint of someone sitting on my bed was present. Fast forward 5 years. My girlfriend came over to do homework. After she'd finished, she took a nap while she waited for her parents. When they arrived, I tried waking her up. She opened her eyes suddenly, looking up at a corner where the wall met the ceiling. She pointed there and went back to sleep. I shook her again. She came to full consciousness and I explained what she'd done. She said, "Up on the wall, I saw a little boy with no eyes. He was there in a Spider-Man pose, staring at me. I freaked out and told her my story about the same kid. Fast forward another 5 years. I was sitting with the same girlfriend and we had a 2-year-old. We were living in my parents' house, in my old room. My daughter started waking up at the same time every night, and she'd talk. After a while, I noticed she had almost the same conversation every night. I playfully asked her who she was talking to. She said, "It's a little boy. He's nice. He's lost and looking for his mommy." My daughter's nightly conversations continued until we got our own place later that year. It seems so cliched to start by saying I don't believe in ghosts, but that's where I'm coming from. A few years ago, I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Melbourne, Australia. It was my first time living on my own. The apartment block had been built in the 1930s. I'd been there for a few months when I came home from work one day and went into the bathroom. I saw something strange. The wooden board covering a hole in the ceiling that led to a small attic space lay broken in 2 pieces on the ground. I examined the broken pieces. The board was an inch thick, and it would have taken Bruce Lee to break it. I thought the landlord had sent someone to work on the attic, but I was frozen stiff with fear. I thought, someone is up there for sure. I emailed pictures to the landlord asking if anyone had been there, with an undertone of annoyance, since she hadn't warned me. Her reply read, "Please call me as soon as you are able to." I called, and she explained that her last 2 tenants had said the same thing. She promised to replace the board, and she did. A month later, I woke up one night around 4 a.m. I had so many goosebumps, it felt like someone was rubbing their hands on me. Everything was silent. But then I heard this sound coming from above my bed. It was a dragging sound, like someone pulling a sack of potatoes. I was frozen, stiff with fear. I thought, someone is up there for sure. There's no way an animal could make that sound. After 5 minutes, I managed to work up the courage to turn on the light and walk to the bathroom. I was armed with a cricket bat. When I looked, I saw that the new board covering the hole was broken in 2. I felt sick. The dragging sound had stopped, but I heard something else. Whispering. The sound was clear and coming from the attic. It sounded like children's voices, and I could hear one sentence repeated over and over. "It's your turn. It's your turn." I freaked out and switched on every light in the apartment, just to make myself feel somewhat normal. It was 5 a.m. and dark outside. I watched TV to try to unwind, but then a fuse blew. My pet bird Dexter, whom I kept in the kitchen, usually never made a sound at night, but he started squawking like he was being strangled. I'd never heard him make those sorts of noises. He was screaming. I grabbed my car keys, ran out, sat in my car, and waited there until the sun came up. When I saw people walking their dogs, it comforted me enough to go back in. The front door was open, but I thought I hadn't closed it when I'd run out. I went to the kitchen to check on Dexter, and he wasn't in his cage. I felt sick again. All my windows were closed, so I looked everywhere inside. When I walked to the bathroom, I heard splashing. Dexter was half drowned in the toilet. I took him out, washed him and dried him, and I was so confused. At 8 a.m., I called the landlord and gave her a watered-down version of the night. "Oh wow, you heard the whispering too?" she said. I stayed in the apartment for another 18 months, and I heard the whispering on a few occasions. And twice the board covering the hole in the ceiling moved. Although now I live elsewhere, the landlord recently called and said her new tenants had begged to speak with me about some of the stuff that's been going on there. Now that I'm an adult, I understand the energy behind poltergeist activity and going through puberty. But back then, it sometimes felt like a war zone. I'll admit, like any teenager, I was often a pain in the butt, although ghost stories couldn't have been further from my mind when I crossed over the threshold of adulthood. Being a late bloomer at 14 years of age, I finally got my period 2 weeks after my birthday, which was when the strange events began. I'll never forget the first night. I got up and went to the bathroom, scared, but soon elated that I was becoming a woman. As I walked back to bed, I felt like something was in the family room behind me. When I backtracked my way to the family room, I realized that the grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped ticking. I noticed that it slowly started up again when I got a few feet away from it. Intrigued as well as creeped out, I stepped backwards and nearly jumped out of my skin when it stopped once again. Back and forth, I kept testing it, and every time, it stopped and started, depending on how close or far away I was. If that wasn't enough, I was soon distracted when the TV suddenly switched itself on. I froze on the spot and craned my neck to see. The static was loud, and I could hear a voice, but it was scratchy and hard to make out. When my father came out in a temper, all the activity subsided. That was only the beginning of a period where I was blamed for all the malfunctioning equipment and appliances in the house. My parents thought I was crying out for attention, but all I wanted was for them to leave me alone. I couldn't convince them that I wasn't to blame for all the strange and sometimes frightening activity. It was worse when I was alone in the house. One afternoon, I got home from school and was relieved to be alone. At first, I put some music on the stereo and sat on my bed to get my homework out of the way. Then I heard a squeaky, grinding noise coming from the door. When I looked up, I saw the handle slowly being pushed down. I stopped breathing as I stared intently at the handle turning 90 degrees, finally stopping like someone was holding the handle down, pointing to the floor. It was excruciating, waiting to see what would happen next. I wondered if it was my brother playing tricks on me, so I jumped off the bed and raced over to the door. I hesitated, as all the terrifying possibilities played across my mind. Staring at the handle, I slowly reached out and prepared to yank the door open, telling myself that if it was my brother, I'd give him a royal butt kicking. Before I had a chance, though, the handle suddenly sprang upwards and back into place. I jumped, but then felt a surge of anger, so I grabbed the handle and opened the door. No one was there. I began to storm through the house, screaming my brother's name and feeling the tears welling up. Not one member of my family was home. I even checked for my cat, even though it was impossible for her to have played with the handle. She was outside on the fence. Then my door slammed shut all by itself. I screamed and ran to the hallway. I stood at the end of the hallway and stared at my door. There were no windows open, and for a minute I wondered if there was a burglar in the house. Thankfully, my parents pulled into the driveway and I raced out to tell them what had happened. My dad's quite a bruiser, so he made us stay outside while he stormed into the house. It was only a few minutes later when he came back outside wielding the baseball bat and shaking his head, very annoyed. He grumpily told us that no one was in the house and that I had to get a grip on myself. I burst into tears and stomped into the house even though I was becoming quite afraid of the whole property. There were so many things that happened to me for that first year that I could easily fill a book. Ornaments would fall off the bookcase, along with the occasional book falling out for no reason. One time, when I went out to the backyard to sunbathe, one particular wind chime went ballistic, while the others stayed still. The hot faucet in the kitchen sink often turned itself on, if I was in the room, and even the toilet flushed when I walked past the bathroom. The strange thing was, during that whole year, the events only happened in our home, not at school or out and about at friends' homes. Then the activity completely stopped on my 15th birthday. Now that I'm 38 and have children of my own, I worry about them going through puberty, and I just hope that they don't have to go through what I did. I'll never know if it was just my own intense energy, but I can definitely say with certainty that I felt like I was under constant psychic attack. I'd like to preface this story by saying that I love my husband and don't have any history of substance abuse or mental illness. Believe me, I'm not giving anything away by telling you guys this information. I just feel that when you tell people about this type of stuff, it's important to start off with a good understanding about the people involved. The same goes for my husband, Dean. We were childhood sweethearts and always knew that we were soulmates, like twins who were separated at birth. That's what makes my story so difficult to share, but I'll cut to the chase because I don't want to bore you with unnecessary details. It all started the night of our honeymoon. Not having a lot of money and wanting to sink what we had into our new home, we decided to stay in a nice cabin near a lake. We had a lot of fantasies about romantic boat rides, champagne and strawberries in front of roaring fires. You get the drift. As soon as we stepped foot in the cabin, I had a hunch that things weren't going to go well. Call it women's intuition. It doesn't matter. It's hard to describe, but I guess the best way to illustrate the atmosphere in the cabin was the sense of death and madness. My heart started palpitating before I even put my bags down. Dean sensed it too, but we decided that it probably just needed airing out, so we opened the windows. But the fresh air didn't help the darkness we felt in the cabin. Being very careful with money, we decided that we would stay, no matter what. We unpacked and decided to go for a walk in the nearby forest, which sloped down to the water. We tried hard to lighten the mood, but the feeling stayed with us everywhere we went. Strange for us, we started to argue about stupid things. Dean started to show disdain at my weak attempts at humor. He scoffed and rolled his eyes, which he'd never done before. There were several times when I felt like he wasn't even himself. Once we got back to the cabin, his nasty new demeanor got worse. I asked him what was wrong and started to cry, which angered him quickly. Just imagine how hard it is to see a man who usually worships the ground you walk on suddenly turn into a psychotic monster. I tried to reason with him, but I soon started to respond in the same way. I became just as aggressive, and soon we were at each other's throats. We were so mad, we barely noticed the evil cackling in the background. As a matter of fact, we both blamed each other for the strange events that began to occur. When a mirror fell from the wall in the spare room, smashing into millions of pieces on a carpeted floor no less, Dean screamed at me from the kitchen, thinking that I had done it. The thing was, I was in the bathroom at the time. By the second night, I felt like I was two people in one. I had moments of lucidity when I cried and tried to plead with Dean to be kind to me. When he snorted in disgust and told me to piss off, I flew into a rage. I shudder when I think of it now, but I grabbed the skillet off the stovetop and threw it at him, narrowly missing his head. It was on. My hands are trembling as I write this. Dean charged at me with his hands out like tiger's claws. I'll never forget his face because it wasn't his face at all. My anger prevented me from screaming in fear as I watched him closing in, looking like an old and twisted madman. His eyes were now dark, where they usually were blue. I felt his hands around my throat, but don't think I stayed still and mute. I felt a banshee screeching from deep inside me. I reached up and scratched his face while he tried to strangle me. The howls that came from our throats were unholy, but there were other voices howling somewhere deep in the forest. It was so surreal. What stopped me was the sight of blood trickling down his cheek. It was like I immediately changed back to my original self. And like a trigger, Dean too slipped back into his usual persona, complete with his handsome face. Suddenly, we hugged each other desperately. Dean whispered into my ear, "We have to get out of here." I didn't even wait to respond. Both of us let go and scrambled around the cabin, dragging our things into our suitcases and racing to get out. The atmosphere in the cabin became darker, and it was difficult to even breathe. Outside, storm clouds had gathered, and soon a heavy downpour came down. We didn't stop until we got in the car. Dean started the engine, and we sat for a moment, staring at the cabin. It was strange, but we felt like we'd escaped a madhouse. When we took off, we both burst into tears and apologized to each other profusely. We never discovered any history of that area and that cabin, but trust me, we're never going back. We all have people and places we like to go when in need of peace and understanding. Whether it be family, friends, or counseling through the medical or religious fields, it's a comfort to know where to turn when we find ourselves in a dark place. It's devastating when you realize that you have no one to turn to and nowhere to go. I'd like to preface this story with the fact that I used to be an atheist, thinking that ghost stories were ridiculous. That's what made what happened to me such a surprise, even though I can't definitively say to this day exactly what happened. Suffice it to say that I was completely bewildered and soon became a believer. Without saying too much about my situation, I was going through a tough time where my whole family turned against me, and my friends gave me a wide berth due to an identity crisis that put me in a dark corner. I went for a long drive one gloomy, rainy day and decided to stop when I saw a church in the mist. Even though I was an atheist, I felt drawn to the imposing structure, which seemed to be more like a shadow in the fog rather than an actual building. As I pulled into the driveway, I could feel an impetus driving me forward and into the building, like tentacles were dragging me in, magnetized by my sorrow. When I walked up the steps, I felt eyes watching me. Strangely enough, I wasn't afraid, even though I felt all the hairs on my body standing erect, as if I'd been electrified. When I went through the door and into the small foyer, I started to see shadows darting here and there. That's when my fear started to build. I asked myself, what am I doing here? I jumped when a voice answered my thoughts. Solace. The voice echoed through the church like a disembodied spirit speaking from the pulpit. I started to shudder, but I couldn't stop myself from walking up the aisle and making my way to the altar. I had to call out, "Is anyone here?" as I assumed that someone was waiting for me, even though the idea was completely absurd. I thought that I was dreaming when I saw hundreds of candles suddenly light up on their own, all around the interior of the church. I thought to myself, this can't be happening. I jumped again when the voice responded, "Believe." I turned around and strained my eyes to see who had spoken to me. Then a shadow came from the back. It was at that moment that I started to believe in ghost stories. This shadow figure soon morphed into a large, looming priest, wearing a hooded cloak, like a Franciscan monk, but completely transparent. I knew that I was looking at a ghost, but I was rooted to the spot. Even though I was afraid, something told me that all this was happening the way it was supposed to. I stood bravely as he approached me and put out his hand. Not knowing what to do, I stayed still and trembled while he placed his hand on top of my head. I then felt a blanket of warmth emanating from my head all the way to my toes. I couldn't see the priest's face under the hood, but I reveled in the glorious transmission of peace. I closed my eyes and wept silently as I felt my spirit filling the dark depths of my body. I was transfixed by the flood of images in my mind, such as a bright blue sky and a brilliant white dove soaring to the heavens. It was all so surreal until I was back in my car. I was parked in an empty field with no church or priest to be seen. It took ages for me to start the car and pull out, as the overwhelming feeling of warmth and peace continued to permeate my soul. Even though I felt like I'd just stepped into the twilight zone, I was not afraid. The rain had ceased and the sun shone through, adding to my feelings of hope and promise for the future. A few weeks later, I was at work and telling a new friend and trusted colleague about my experience. She advised that it didn't matter if the church existed or not. She said that God had reached out and touched my soul in my darkest hour. From that day forth, I accepted my identity and at the same time, my connection with the divine. You know this place is haunted, right? Those 7 words were a godsend to me when I heard them for the first time. I had just started my new job as a caregiver for Briarwood Group Home. I had the weekend shift, taking care of developmentally disabled women. My new job was fun, but incredibly dull before the lovely ladies in the home woke up for the day. My 2 co-workers, Michelle and Jade, were very nice, but I was wary. The first 2 hours of our shift were spent sitting on the couch. I felt off just sitting there, like I wasn't doing enough and they were going to report me to our coordinator. So hearing Michelle's claims of a haunting had my interest immediately. I gave her a polite, "Oh?" waiting for her to elaborate. She told me excitedly about cabinets slamming and closet doors swinging open. She told me about a man's voice being heard over a monitor, though we had no male clients, and men weren't allowed to work there due to false allegations from one of our girls. She told me that one girl said there was a man living in her closet. Before she could tell me more, Jade had cut her off. She told her it probably wasn't a good idea to scare new staff away. I wanted to hear more, but Michelle didn't go into further detail. It was almost time to get the girls going for the day at that point, and it was brushed to the side. It was almost forgotten until a month later. In late February, my coordinator called me in a panic. Both of our night aides called out about 5 minutes before the start of their shifts, and he had no coverage for the overnight shift. I accepted, and all was well until 2 a.m. It was time for bed checks. One of the clients was a 73-year-old woman named May. I opened the door to her room last, and my heart dropped when I couldn't tell if she was okay. She's usually a heavy sleeper, and when I called her name, it was no surprise that I didn't get a response. But from where I stood in the hallway, I couldn't hear her soft snoring. I went into her room and approached her bed. Once I was close enough, I couldn't see the gentle rise and fall of the blankets to let me know that she was breathing. So I decided to lean down and place my head on her chest. Why I didn't just check her pulse is beyond me, to see if I could hear her heartbeat. If I couldn't, I didn't want to think about it. I bent forward, and when my head was inches away from May's chest, I felt it, from behind me. It felt like someone had forcefully exhaled onto the back of my neck. It wasn't May, because her head was facing the wall. I jumped up right away and ran out of the room, heading to what I thought was the safety of our office administration room. Behind me, I heard rapid footsteps. Only one of our girls could put her shoes on, but she was completely blind and could not do so until staff placed one in her hand to get her started. And these were heavy, sounding like someone wearing boots. I was too scared to look back and slammed the door shut after I entered the room, collapsing into the desk chair. My relief at reaching the room was short-lived. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Like something out of a horror movie, the knob started slowly turning. I shot myself across the room in the chair, slamming my entire body weight against the door. I'm not small, and I was putting every ounce of strength I could. The door budged a little, but slammed back shut. I got the sense to lock it, and that's when the banging started. It must have only lasted for a minute or two, but every second felt like an eternity. The pounding against the door was frantic, then came to a sudden stop. No footsteps. Nothing. Silence. I leaned over to where my purse was, on the med table, grabbing my phone. I had started crying and could barely get the words out to my mom when she answered. I never called her so late, so she knew it was for a reason. She let me vent and collect myself. She stayed on the phone with me for a while, letting me ramble to her to ease my anxiety. I felt more at ease talking to my mom, but soon enough, it was time for the 4 a.m. bed check. I was terrified of someone being in the house. We have door alarms, so nobody could have left without setting them off. If we had an intruder, they were still there. My mom assured me that she wouldn't let me be alone, and if something happened, she'd call 911 from my dad's phone. Her bravery gave me the courage I needed. I checked on all the girls, starting with May. She was completely fine and snoring away under her blankets. All 5 other girls were sound asleep. My mom encouraged me to check everywhere. The closets, the showers, under every bed, behind every door, even our cleaning supply closet. All clear. I was relieved that we didn't have an intruder, but I was horrified. I thought Michelle and Jade were just trying to be jerks and scare the new girl, but now I 100% believed them when they said Briarwood was haunted. And this was just the beginning. Firstly, a few things about me. I'm 24 years old, currently living with my dad and sister for some unknown virus-related reason. We all sleep upstairs. I have 2 dogs, and I'm not much of a ghost enthusiast, but I very much do believe in them. Sometimes I'll watch a couple of spooky or ghost vids on YouTube before bed because I find them interesting. This experience happened last night and 2 other times within the week. So, my dad vibrates my feet at the end of the bed, and so I know someone is walking around the house. Depending on the loudness of the stomp or the severity of the vibration, I can typically tell if it's my dad or sister walking around, going up the stairs and such, based on these vibrations. Last night around 2:30 to 3 a.m., I started feeling these vibrations at my feet. They're strong and heavy ones. I can feel and hear them walking and pacing in the hallway outside my door. I hear the fast vibrations of running up and down the stairs. I even feel and hear it come into my room, then leave. I hear it stepping on the hardwood floor downstairs. This goes on for over an hour. Just constant vibrations and constant thuds. And then suddenly, it stops. And I finally get to sleep. I tried to think logically about what this could be. Could it have been my dogs? My dog sleeps in my room, and my sister's dog sleeps in her room. I was also surprised my dog didn't wake up from the commotion, but then again, she's really old. Could it be just my positioning in the bed? Maybe the box fan I keep on next to my face? I turned the fan off, turned over to a different position, and I still heard the steps. Water pipes? The water pipes have a distinct sound, and even through last night, I heard the water pipes and footsteps at the same time. Very different sounds. Could it be my heartbeat? Could the blood flowing to my feet cause the thudding or vibration feeling? I laid up and they were still there. I thought of everything. It wasn't my sister or dad, because they go to bed at 9 or 9:30 and most certainly wouldn't be roaming around the house for over an hour. A burglar? Nothing was taken. No signs of forced entry. Last night was the third time I've experienced this phenomena, and every time I freak the hell out. Especially when this thing goes to my room, I just feel it watching me. I told my dad about it this morning, and after I went through all the logical reasons and how it couldn't be them, he told me maybe I was dreaming, but then again, I know I wasn't. Creepy things keep happening in my house. I have a lot of stories, so I'll just go in chronological order. I'm a pretty skeptical person, but other people have experienced things in my house too, so I'm looking for an explanation. The first experience that I remember that I'd call paranormal was when I was about 6. I was in bed, but the room wasn't completely dark because there was a gap at the bottom of the door, so light could come in from the hallway. My dad was in a band at the time, and when he'd come home late, he'd come downstairs and say goodnight. I wasn't asleep yet, and I was lying on my back. I opened my eyes, and I saw a hand over my face. Thinking it's my dad trying to scare me, I reach up to grab the hand, and my hand goes through it. I screamed, and my mom came to see what was wrong, but no one else was in the room, and my dad wasn't even home yet. When I used to sleep in that room, I'd sometimes see shadows in the gap above the door, way too high up to be one of my parents passing through the door. The way my house is set up, there's a hallway in the basement. The big room at one end of the hallway has windows, and the room at the other end doesn't, because my house is built into the side of a hill. The two occurrences mentioned above took place in a room on one side of the hallway without windows. I moved my bedroom from that room to the room at the very end of the hallway without windows. My friend and I were in there when we were probably 8 to 9 years old. The door was closed, but we could hear scratching on the other side, like someone was rubbing the wood with a toothbrush or something. When we opened the door, there was nothing there. I was sleeping in that room one night, door closed, and in my dream, 2 children were crawling down the hallway, coming from the big room with windows. One of the children laughed, and I woke up to see my dog growling at the closed door. I didn't tell anyone about it because I figured it was just a dream. About 2 years after that, I had a group of friends over. There were 7 of us, ages 11 to 13. 2 of my friends went upstairs to get popcorn around midnight or 1 a.m. And my parents were sleeping, so they knew they had to be quiet. About 4 minutes after they left, we hear them screaming, and they come running back into my bedroom, and they're both crying. One of them believed heavily in the paranormal because she lost her mom at a young age, and it's comforting to her. But the other girl was very skeptical and didn't really believe in ghosts. We asked them what was wrong, and they said as they were coming back down the stairs, they heard little kids laughing in the corner of the room at the end of the hallway. They knew it wasn't our voices echoing off the wall because my bedroom door was closed and my room's pretty much soundproof. Basically, if you're in my room with the door closed, you can hear things outside, but they can't hear you unless you yell really loud. After they told me they heard little kids laughing, I told them about my dream, and they all agreed that was super weird. We all ended up sleeping in the living room instead of my bedroom. After that, my experiences are pretty isolated. One of my friends stayed with me during quarantine, and when he was home alone, he heard a little kid's voice clearly say, "Hi, kitty." No TVs were on, and I live in the middle of nowhere, so I don't have neighbors for at least half a mile. Last year was 13 years since my grandma died, and a painting that belonged to her fell down the stairs from the 3rd floor. As far as any of us knew, the painting had been stored in the attic, which is closed 90% of the time, and no one had been upstairs to disturb it. For online school, I've been mostly on the 3rd floor, since that's where Wi-Fi is best. And sometimes when I'm doing homework, I'll hear what sounds like a little kid crying coming from the attic. I'd like to say that it might be one of my cats, but neither of them sound anything like that. There were weird circles of rocks in the woods behind my house that my mom calls witches' circles, but she doesn't believe in the paranormal at all. The last experience is not an experience of mine, and I don't know exactly when it happened, but I was probably 4 or 5. My babysitter was a family friend, and I think she was about 17 at the time. And she had to stay up overnight because my parents were away on a trip. I asked her recently if she thought my house was haunted, expecting her to say no, but she said she absolutely believed that it was. She said that one of the nights that she had to stay over, at around 1 in the morning, she woke up to see a little kid standing in the doorway of the room where she was sleeping. She thought it was me at first, but when she said my name, the child turned to the side and walked down the stairs toward the front door. She didn't hear the door open or close, and when she tried to follow it, she didn't see anything. She said the child couldn't have been me because I had short blonde hair and the kid she saw had long dark hair. Aside from those, I can't think of any other stories, and I definitely don't have an explanation. My house was built specifically for us in the 80s. My parents used to have tenants, but no one else has lived in the house since the early 90s, and no one's ever died here. I know that the land where my house is built used to be an apple orchard that burned down, but I can't find any records that indicate there was a previous house on the property, or that anyone died in the fire. When I was about 15 or 16, I was doing my Duke of Edinburgh award, which involves camping and orienteering. We pitched our tents in a low valley in the mountains. It was at the foot of Slieve Donard in Northern Ireland. Me and my friend carelessly made our guide ropes super long. We made them so long that everyone was tripping over them in the daylight. But the tent was up and we couldn't be bothered to fix it. I woke in the night to footsteps and heard someone brush against our tent. I didn't think much of it, assuming one of the boys was taking a leak, and tried to get back to sleep. The next morning, as the aroma of sizzling bacon was filling the air, I asked who bumped our tent last night. Everyone denied it, but someone had walked around our tent. A few other people heard the same thing, and the 2 class clowns in the group said that they had been fast asleep and hadn't heard a thing. I would have thought they would have at least joined in with the "I heard it, I heard something," trying to freak us out. One of the more sensible guys in our group said someone had walked around his tent, but he had noticed that they didn't have a light. One of our teachers, who was pitched further away, admitted hearing footsteps too. Our Duke of Ed facilitator finally said, "You're not the first group to hear those footsteps, you know." We all turned around, perplexed now. He asked us, had we seen the ice house further down the valley? It was built to persevere ice for food storage before electricity. Yes, we had all seen it. "Did you read the plaque on it?" I hadn't noticed it. No one had seemed to. But my buddy Andrew spoke up. "Yeah, about the man who died in it?" The facilitator nodded. I laughed it off and headed back to my tent to get my mug for a hot cup of tea, and tripped over the guide ropes. Then it suddenly struck me. How did the person who walked around our tent so close he could touch not trip over the guide ropes? It was the fall of 2003, and school had just reopened a few months prior. I'd spent the summer vacation working hard at a fast food business full time. I was now around 16 years old and would often party a lot with some friends throughout the neighborhood. Despite being back in school, I managed to work on the weekends, so I still had money to blow. This particular weekend, it was a keg party with my friends Charles and Jim. We were all pretty buzzed and wanted to see if a mutual friend in a nearby subdivision had some pot, since either no one at the party had any or wanted to share. It was close to midnight when we decided to embark on our quest. The trees were wearing bare of their leaves on the eve of another Ohio winter. The air was chilled and smelled of decaying foliage, still soaked from rain the night before. The moon was full and sparse clouds filled the night sky, passing by at a brisk pace. We walked down the dimly lit streets of the neighborhood, which ran its course straight back to where we were headed. Along the way, we would stop and hide every so often when seeing headlights, fearing either our parents or the cops would catch us breaking curfew. Jim suggested we stop off at his house to grab a few things before we headed out further. He grabbed a soda for all of us, which I gladly accepted. We also took 2 short swords that we found a few months prior that were behind the trailer park while trekking through the woods. They were both rusted up pretty good and caked in mud before we cleaned them up. The blades were less than 1 inch wide, and at the hilt there was some kind of Latin writing. It was an unusual but novelty find, so we kept them. The lot of us probably made a comical sight to anyone who had been observing our trio walking down the street. Charles with his curly red hair and freckled pale skin carrying a short sword, Jim staggering a bit, even dragging his sword loudly across the pavement behind him, jovial at times. The entrance to the adjacent trailer park was a cut in the fence leading out from our neighborhood. In a bit of a daring mood, I inquired if we should take a shortcut across the field and through the dark woods instead. "Are you sure about that?" Jim asked, resting his hand nervously on his head, then through his sandy brown hair. "Yeah." "What, are you scared?" I mused. Charles smilingly joked, "You know it's a full moon, right?" "Oh, don't tell me now. You too?" I laughed. "Okay, screw it, let's go," Jim replied. After walking to the back of the park, half of me really regretted my boastful opt to take the shortcut through the woods. The field had been chunky from last year's till. The saturated clay ran off with puddles of water and mud. Out across the field, the outline of the trees appeared as a towering, foreboding mass. The bare branches of the tops were like outstretched fingers, scratching at the sky. The moon seemed to hover over where the hollow tree would be, the clouds still moving at an offset, quickening pace. This particular night seemed uniquely and utterly haunting. I don't know, guys. I started becoming fearful. "Oh, really now? We just came all this way, man," Jim replied, a bit smug. "Yeah, just kidding," I lied nervously. Once reaching the tree line, the aroma of pine needles and decaying woods struck my senses. It seemed like I had hit a brick wall, and a great part of me was quite reluctant to enter the dark, enveloping woodlands. I stumbled a bit through the brush and bushes between the trees, Charles and Jim close behind, often holding away branches or thorn vines for each other. After breaking through the front line of trees, we reached the clearing, and there in our midst stood the hollow tree. In the middle of the clearing, the statuary monolith was illuminated by the moonlight that shone down upon it, almost as if it were some sort of druid's shrine. The tall ash-colored branches that rose straight up creaked loudly, swaying with the whistling wind. We all paused for a moment, staring at this tree in all its mystery, glimpsing into its hollow void, half expecting some creature that dwelt within to leap upon us. We all seemed transfixed by the creepy scenery, reluctant to go any further. It was as if conditions were ripe for evil to manifest. "Over there," Jim whispered frantically. "What? What?" I asked, concerned. "I saw it," Charles said gravely. "Saw what?" I asked, scared. "A shadow. Something big walking, dark, like a spirit," Charles replied. "Really, guys?" I choked back a laugh, attempting to mask my fear. I was still a little buzzed from the drinking we were doing that night, and I had sometimes had this brazen approach to spirits. Over the years, whenever I thought I was dealing with a ghost of any sort, I would put up this ultra-aggressive front to provoke it or call it out. I never believed spirits could actually hurt you. I just thought they could speak or throw objects, but not hurt people. I had this mentality that if you show these things that you're not afraid, then they cannot touch you. Emboldened by this philosophy, I began to taunt this being, still somewhat doubting its existence. My friends must be playing a joke on me, I thought, so I was going to show that I wasn't afraid. "Hey," I yelled. "Screw you," I continued. "I'm not afraid of you. Come and get some." I kept egging on into my surroundings. All of a sudden, I saw a tall shadow float across between two trees about 20 feet in front of me. I look about the area, seeing if something might have cast a shadow. To my dismay, just my friends stood there in disbelief, still holding the slender swords at their sides. "Come on, man, stop," they pleaded. "No, screw that," I screamed. "Come on, you sissy," I screamed one last time. And with that final word, a dark mass enveloped around me, lifting me up a few feet off the ground, carrying me over to a nearby tree. I struggled, still defiant, although utterly terrified. I couldn't move and was being restrained by this entity, held against a pine tree. I looked down and saw Charles standing there, mouth wide open in disbelief, with sword still in hand as the edge was resting on the ground. Jim was motionless too, frozen with fear, just shocked, staring up at me. After what felt like a few minutes, I stopped struggling. Then promptly the being let go of me. I fell, slumping down, and landing at the base of the tree. My friends cautioned over to me. Concerned, they helped me to get on my feet. "Oh my God, that was insane," I stuttered. My friends couldn't believe what had happened. We continued talking about the event later that night, after leaving the enchanted woodlands. This was the first time something had physically touched me. I was completely creeped out. The amount of strength and force that spirit had led me to realize the foolishness of my actions to provoke it. I never returned to that area, as I didn't want a repeat of what had happened on that dark night. I believe we are all born with an inherent sense of good and evil. What drives us to go in either direction is the influence of outside forces, some more powerful than others. A couple of years ago, while I was living in Mendocino, California, I had just dropped off my younger sister at karate practice. It was later on in the evening, the moment where the sun just starts to set and the sky ignites in purple and golden colors. It seemed like a nice night for it, so I decided to go on a short drive while my sister finished her class. I knew the county fairly well, but decided to drive down some back roads I didn't recognize. I figured, why not, right? After a while on this one particular road, I started to notice that I could no longer spot any houses or other cars. It seemed that the road was getting thinner and thinner as I rolled along. I decided to turn around, and as I came to a slow stop, my radio suddenly cut out. Strange. That had never happened before. I started fiddling with the dials, but all I could get out of it was silence. This is when I started to feel creeped out and decided to make a U-turn. As I stopped my car, I jumped at the sight of a mysterious figure standing in the middle of the road. The man was enormously tall and had the longest limbs I'd ever seen. His arms were almost like tentacles, absent of any bone. He was wearing a black suit and tie, and as I looked up, I became horrified to learn that his face had no features. No nose, no mouth, no eyes, just a complete void. I couldn't put the car into drive, I was so shocked. At just that moment, a voice entered my head, of a man whispering. It told me to run my car into the man and kill him. It repeated the words, "Kill him," over and over. All the while, the man just ominously stood facing in my direction. All at once, I screamed and slammed my foot down on the gas. I ignored the call of the voice and sped off in the opposite direction. eventually making my way back into town. A week later, I opened the newspaper to learn that a car had veered off the road near the area where the incident had happened to me. The passenger in the car died on impact. I'm convinced that the tall man had accomplished his goal, and convinced that driver to go off the side of the road and wind up with a fate that could have happened to me. My cousin lived in an old farmhouse in the 80s, near a small prairie town in Elstow in Saskatchewan. Her father owned and operated the hotel there during that time, although it no longer exists today. My cousin was going to bartend at the hotel beverage room. Her husband was working in Saskatoon, about 40 miles away. They couldn't believe their good luck when they found this place for rent at such a cheap price. It was an old house, but not decayed like it is today. The farmstead was situated perhaps a half a mile from the highway, and then maybe another mile to the hotel, but it was very isolated. Absolutely no neighbors within view. From the time they moved in, my cousin experienced strange things, such as footsteps on the stairway or downstairs, and at times would smell the scent of oranges in the kitchen. Her husband was away a lot, working long hours, and she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable living in that house. One evening, she had friends over, and they were enjoying a few brews by a bonfire just after dusk, when this guy and girl appeared out of nowhere, acting very strange. Their clothes were odd, as if they had attended a costume party. She said they were dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The guy was muttering and acting strange. He tried to climb the windmill in the yard, which was already rickety and dangerous, even back then. The pale, oddly dressed girl never said a word. The guys in the group told the couple to get the hell out or they'd call the cops, and they left. It was pitch dark outside when they walked toward the highway, disappearing into the night. Everyone agreed that they were freaked out by the pair. Several hours later, the RCMP drove into the yard, asking if they'd seen a girl, as motorists on the highway reported seeing a girl in torn clothing running down the road. They told the Mountie what had occurred earlier that evening. Soon afterward, my cousin and her husband moved out. She couldn't face a long, isolated winter living there. Her nerves were shot. Strangely, after moving out, the locals told her it was a well-known haunted house, and they thought she was already aware of that. She wasn't. My story begins on July 1st, 2013. For years, when I drove to Manitou Beach, near Saskatchewan, I'd look for the house as I passed. You can only see the distinctive windmill, which identifies the farmstead on the drive back. My friend Darlene, who's very sensitive, was with me, and I impulsively decided to stop and check it out. I felt compelled. The house had never been lived in since my cousin rented it and moved out. Now it was very dilapidated. The road had grown in, so we drove as far as we could on the dirt road and walked the rest of the way. There was a marshy, water-filled moat around three sides of the old farmstead. It didn't exist when my cousin lived there. I honestly felt a weird feeling growing within me as I approached the house, and it was Darlene who voiced that same feeling. I started snapping pictures with my smartphone and was drawn over and over again to one specific area. I was thinking to myself that there was a female presence at work, and again Darlene turned to me saying the exact same thing. I figured maybe I could catch something, so I held up my phone with the audio record on. I said that my cousin and her husband were the last people to live in that house, and I wondered if they remembered her. Then I spoke her name. Suddenly, there was an extremely loud bang that came out of nowhere. Darlene screamed, and the hairs on my arms stood straight up. It was a super hot, windless day, but suddenly I felt very cold. Darlene had had enough and wanted to go, so we headed back to my car. When we got there, I listened to the recording. It recorded everything until the second before the bang, and then abruptly stopped. I looked over the pictures, trying to find anything unusual, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary at that time. Much later, in early September, when I was checking out the pictures again, I saw a female form in the entrance of the shed. The picture was taken through a bashed-out window that, looking through another bashed-out window, showed the shed in the backyard. The image made my heart freeze. I was positive nothing was there the first time. The pictures I shot before the recording don't show that image, even though I shot at the exact same spot. They're not great pictures, and I suck at photography, but I get a jolt every time I zoom in and see that form. I get a feeling of negativity combined with an energy that's somehow very sad and defeated. It was around 11 o'clock one warm spring night in the early 90s in an older neighborhood in El Paso, Texas. Myself and 3 other friends, Marco, Fernie, and Herman, were walking Fernie home, but we took a shorter route to his house, which led to the patio door of his residence. We started walking down B Street, and just before C Street, we felt and then noticed someone walking behind us. We all turned around and noticed a dark, male-looking figure in the shadows, standing in the middle of B Street. What was odd was that even though there was just enough light for us to make out facial features, we couldn't. It was a solid, black being. Herman or Marco shouted at it, using profanity, but it just stood there. All of a sudden, it stretched out its arms and started approaching us. Not knowing what to think, we started running. And as we ran towards the corner of B and C streets, I remember we all looked back and saw this figure walking at a normal pace, but its arms were even longer and seemed to still be growing. I also remember that it was more lit in that corner, but this being was still solid black. We cut towards A Street using C Street, and as we approached that corner, we looked back and it was nowhere in sight. But to our surprise, this figure was now on A Street, approaching C Street. It was still a solid black figure, and this time under a light post on A Street. It was walking at a normal pace, but its arms were even longer now. We couldn't believe it. We actually stopped running and stood there at the corner, just staring at this thing. Though I can't remember what we shouted at it as we stood there, I know it still kept walking towards us. Then, all of a sudden, it picked up its pace, so we started running down A Street, towards Fernie's patio door at the end of the street. I turned one last time before we reached our destination, and this thing was a lot closer than I had thought. Then, when we reached the patio door, we all looked up the street, and this being was nowhere to be found. It was gone, just like that. After talking about it later on, we all agreed the best comparison was to Freddy Krueger in one of the earlier Nightmare on Elm Street movies. There's a scene where he's chasing a girl in an alley, and his arms begin to grow longer and longer into this grotesque form. We've had other creepy experiences since then, but nothing like that. Like everyone in this world, I will, one day, meet my maker. But for now, I stay one step ahead of the Reaper. He's been chasing me ever since I was a little boy, when I nearly died in the middle of a fever due to an infection. The doctor went as far as to prepare my family for my demise. Terror rings true when death is imminent. I remember lying in my bed, drenched with sweat, as the light in the room darkened to pitch black. My teeth chattered and I felt a frosty breeze creeping from my toes right up to my small head. That's when I saw him. A tall, frightening, hooded specter descending from the darkest shadows of what I thought was my bedroom. What terrified me the most was his skeletal face and the dry, thorny tongue lolling about over his jagged teeth. I screamed as the roar of what seemed like 1,000 tornadoes splintered my eardrums while he raised his sight. Whether it was my lust for life or my childish impudence, I turned my back on him and yelled, "It's my life." I didn't know at the time that I'd cheated death. But suddenly the lights were back on and I was screaming on the floor. My mom raced in and scooped me up. I tried to tell my parents about what happened, but they assumed the fever had made me hallucinate. From that day forward, I had an incredible understanding that I was in control of my destiny. I knew deep down in my soul that the only reason people died was due to them giving up and losing the fight. I was afforded the opportunity to cheat death many times over the years, despite my attempts to stay safe. When I was a teenager, doing what reckless teenagers are apt to do, speeding in my car, he returned. It was a rainy night, and the car crashed into a huge tree. I was barely conscious when I heard the familiar tornadoes. My eardrums pulsed in pain as the pitch-black darkness tried to consume me, while my bloodied head tried to lift up. I remember gripping the steering wheel with all my might, and through gritted teeth screaming, "It's my life! It's not my time!" I saw the Reaper glaring at me with his black eyes through the windshield, his enraged skull against the glass. After butting his skull angrily against the glass, he disappeared, and I was suddenly dragged out of the burning car. One of the creepiest encounters was when I was in my late 20s, carelessly walking through a bad neighborhood. I was checking out an isolated section of scrubland next to a railway track when I heard footsteps behind me. Before I could turn around to face my attacker, I felt the searing pain of a long blade being thrust into my back. A flush of cold panic rushed throughout my nervous system as the attacker plucked my wallet from my pants pocket. Then, once again, the deafening tornadoes rushed into my ears while the impenetrable darkness washed over me. The Reaper appeared in front of me, striding towards me with his huge scythe, held high by a skeletal hand. He seemed to be mocking me as an evil laugh broke through the tornadoes in my ears.
Now you're mine.
He dragged me up with the other bony hand, bringing my face only an inch away from his. I felt his sandpaper tongue scrape my cheek as the bottomless pits that were his eyes bore into my soul. Screaming, "I'll never be yours," into the Reaper's face, I saw a flash of light as he yelled in outrage, "No!" Since then, I've been on constant lookout. My wife recently gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The other night, I could have sworn I saw a shadow hovering over them both in the darkness. Not being terribly religious, I was less than enthusiastic when Mom asked me to help with cleaning up an old church. She'd always enjoyed interior decorating and was so excited for us to be working together. I'm sure that she had ulterior motives, as she'd always bemoaned the fact that I'd strayed from the fold. Nonetheless, I joined in with gusto, and soon we were having a blast, clearing debris and cleaning the building. When we went upstairs to continue our work on a dark, stormy day, I noticed that the atmosphere was different. It was strange that it was colder up there and the tattered curtains didn't budge, even though it was windy outside. One particular room was gloomy and oppressive. I hesitated. It reminded me of many dark ghost stories. Mom laughed and shook her head. "What's wrong with you? You're in the house of the Lord," she admonished. I couldn't shake off the nefarious feeling, but I followed her in and picked up a broom. I swept the floor haphazardly while she checked out an old leather swivel chair. She sat in it and spun around. When her laughter turned dark, my flesh crawled. I turned around and tripped over the broom, falling on the floor. The thing in the chair was not my mother. I was so horrified I didn't even think to try and get up. All I could do was stare at the terrifying sight before me. Strapped to the chair with crude straps, it seemed to be a woman possessed by something unholy. She thrashed and wrenched herself around as she tried to get free, snapping and snarling through gnashing teeth. I screamed, "Mom," as the demonic woman screamed louder, with a black forked tongue flicking out of the mouth. Frantically scrambling to my feet, I picked up the broom to use as a weapon, although I had no idea how. What if I was hallucinating, and that creature was really my mother? I cried as I searched my mind for an answer. I shook as I edged towards it, nearly vomiting with the acrid stench coming from it. My pulse raced as I got closer and closer. I saw a rosary pulled tight across the cracked skin and the horrific yellow eyes staring wildly. There was a deep wound where the crucifix had burned into the forehead, showing black, putrid flesh. Before I got closer, the wind picked up so violently that the tattered curtains were ripped from the windows. Now the creature was hissing in between terrifying howls and screams, grimacing and contorting in the chair. What struck me next was the disembodied incantation of an exorcism. but I couldn't see where it was coming from. While the possessed woman writhed around and screeched louder, I saw welts and slashes form across her skin. Somehow I knew that holy water was being sprinkled onto her body. Right then, I knew what to do. I dropped to my knees and started intoning the Lord's Prayer. The deafening chaos continued around me. I can't explain how or why, but I could feel the drops of holy water flicking on my own skin. I clamped my eyes shut. In a flash, the noise stopped. I felt a familiar hand on my shoulder. I looked up and saw my mother, looking amazed. Jumping up, I saw that the demonic woman was gone. The horror was over. I clung to my mother while she soothed away my tears, welcoming me back to the fold. The most disturbing event in my life happened when I was just a young child. Before I first saw the ghost in the tunnel, on my way to summer camp, I barely knew what ghost stories were. My father and I were singing and chatting until we started driving through a long, dark tunnel. The atmosphere was creepy and almost surreal as I gasped when the air inside the car became harder to breathe. My father continued talking, but I became increasingly disturbed with the pale fluorescent lights bouncing off the walls. Then I saw her, a terrifying specter with no pupils, her eyes glowing white as her somber face watched us go by. I screamed, and Dad turned around yelling, "What? What's the matter with you?" I couldn't explain further than the ghost girl as I pointed to the wall of the tunnel. She seemed to be traveling with us as we moved through the tunnel, impassively staring right through me. Dad craned his neck to see. "There's nothing there. You're imagining things. Calm down," he advised. As the car finally came out the other end, the air became normal again, and I looked back, but she was gone. I almost forgot about the ghost girl until my father picked me up at the end of summer camp, and we made our way back home. Like a typical kid, I excitedly told Dad all about the camp, but I stopped talking when I noticed the familiar tunnel. "Are you asleep?" he asked. I swallowed the lump in my throat as the darkness descended. The air once again became thick as the fluorescent lights appeared. This time, it was like I was seeing visions inside my own mind. A rainy night, skidding tires, and a car in flames. Then the ghost girl appeared. Her eyes were frightening, white and unblinking, as she stared right through me. Somehow I understood that she had been killed in that accident, but it didn't make it easier to see her scary face. She seemed angry, although not at me. It almost felt like she was trapped in time, haunting the tunnel forever. I struggled to breathe as I felt her presence start to move inside the car. I couldn't be certain, but it felt like she was trying to come with us, to escape her fate, a fate that had already been set. As she passed through, like a chilling wind whipping through the car, I watched her being pulled back into the tunnel. I never understood haunting stories until that day. She seemed to be trying to tell me something, although my young mind couldn't grasp what that could be. As we approached the end of the tunnel, I noticed that her frightening, although sad eyes looked away. Like a vacuum sucking her back in, the tunnel swallowed her up, and we pulled away as we drove on. I couldn't shake off her face, and as the years rolled by, I tried to research her story, but to no avail. We moved to another state, and I never saw her again. I wonder if it was all a dream, as my dad doesn't remember. Sometimes her haunting face enters my dreams, beckoning to me with her sad eyes. I lived in a house that I called the House from Hell for 4 years, from age 11 to almost 16. There was constantly something happening. Doors flying open and shut, voices, footsteps. Nothing ever stayed where you put it. I was alone there a lot because both my parents worked and I was constantly terrified. One of the most gut-level disturbing things, though, was the little girl in my bathroom. Every time I walked past my bathroom door, which was constantly since it was right outside my bedroom, I saw a little girl with blonde curled hair and a rose-colored dress. She just stood there, staring, looking like a photograph from 1905. I started keeping the door closed so I could walk by without seeing her, but she was always there when I opened it. Once I stepped in past her. I couldn't see her anymore, but I could feel her there. She scared me, but I felt really sorry for her because she was trapped there, just like me, but probably forever. As the years went by, and things in the house continued to get worse, she started seeming darker. I started feeling like she wasn't really a little girl. I knew there was something ugly in the house, and I felt like it was presenting this sympathetic image to me. Then I started thinking maybe I was completely losing my mind. One day, when I was 14, I had a friend from out of town come stay with me for a week. I hadn't told her anything whatsoever about the house because I didn't think she'd come if I did. Right after she got there, we were sitting in my room and she left to go to the bathroom. About a minute later, she walked back in with a puzzled look on her face and said, "So, there's a little girl in your bathroom?" Yeah, she hangs out in there. Blonde hair, curls, pink dress? Yeah. You know that's not really a little girl, don't you? I almost threw up. I was so relieved and terrified and excited and ready to run out of the house screaming. She wouldn't use my bathroom the rest of the week, and I started to use it as little as possible, without pissing off my parents who didn't want to believe. Eventually we moved out, and I couldn't have been happier. I distanced myself from it mentally as much as I could. Then, when I was 18, I took another friend on a road trip to pack up a few things that I'd left in the house. My parents hadn't managed to sell it, and wouldn't for 5 more years. The minute we got on the property, my friend seemed uncomfortable. When we came around the bend in the long, steep driveway, he went completely white. I could tell something was wrong, but he insisted he was okay, so we got to work. After a while, he asked to use the bathroom, and I directed him to mine. Not even 20 seconds after he left, he came running back in, gasping for breath, and slammed the bedroom door behind him. He started babbling about a little blonde girl who isn't really a little girl. All of a sudden, he went dead still, looked me in the eye, and very solemnly said, "She's not happy with you. You left, and you weren't supposed to." After that, we threw whatever we could grab in 2 trips into my car, and I walked him to another bathroom and waited outside the door, and we got the hell out of there as fast as we could. When I was younger, my uncle bought a property in the country for the purpose of raising crops. It was sprawling green land of over 40 acres, with a homestead out the front where my uncle and his family lived. A strange part of the property included an abandoned farmhouse toward the back, which my uncle had blocked off. At a family reunion one year, when I was 12, I overheard the adults talking about the farmhouse's history. Apparently, the original owner had slaughtered his family, and even the family pets. My uncle had some dairy cows, horses, and 2 cattle dogs, all of which refused to venture near the farmhouse. I heard him tell my parents that even rodents and insects couldn't be found there, within a 50-foot radius. My 11-year-old cousin and I were fascinated with the stories, and secretly we planned to investigate the next day. Even though we both delighted in telling and listening to scary stories, we were a little apprehensive. Our parents had warned us to stay away, but we snuck off and pretended that we were going to visit the horses. After wandering around, deliberately taking our time, we were soon climbing over the stile and facing the farmhouse. We'd both been chattering and enjoying each other's company, but now the looming building lulled us into silence. It was strange that a misty fog was settled around the farmhouse, and a strong sense of foreboding came over me. My cousin was braver than I was, and she took off before me, shouting over her shoulder, "Come on, chicken." I swallowed the lump in my throat and followed suit, although I dragged my steps and felt the darkness come over me. As we approached, the stillness made me shiver, while the boarded windows suggested that evil was contained within. I stopped at the front steps while my cousin raced onto the porch. She turned and waved me over to join her. "You go in first," I said. She rolled her eyes and put her hand on the doorknob, but then she yanked her hand away in fright. Although afraid, I was annoyed with her. "What's wrong?" I asked. She shook her head and turned the knob. Soon, I was right behind her, and we slowly stepped in. The door creaked loudly, and the heavy air swallowed us up. The building was soon silent, and we moved towards the stairs. Neither of us spoke, due to the overwhelming fear. We jumped when all of a sudden a dog barked, like an echo. Then a shot rang out from what sounded like a void within a memory. We were then distracted by a creepy creaking noise, which made our flesh crawl and the hairs on the back of our necks stand up. My cousin whispered, "What is that?" before turning to look behind us. She began to scream, and her eyes widened. I turned to follow her gaze and saw a woman hanging from the dusty chandelier. We raced upstairs to escape. We could barely breathe, now crying and clinging to each other. Then more screams came from one of the bedrooms. Trembling uncontrollably, we saw a little boy and girl race out of the room, covered in blood. After that, we bolted straight out the front door, past the hanging woman, all the way back to my uncle's house. We didn't tell anyone for fear of what would happen to us if we did. For many years, my wife, my brother, and I have enjoyed getting into the great outdoors, which includes a lot of hiking and fishing, especially for my brother, who considers himself kind of an expert in fly fishing. When we camped by a beautiful, secluded river last spring, he was ecstatic. My wife and I woke up early one morning and decided to go for a hike and do some wild strawberry picking. Naturally, my brother decided that he wanted to try his luck again and fly fishing the pristine river. The day turned out to be glorious, so we decided to keep hiking and picking while my brother continued fishing. It was almost twilight when we returned to camp, and as soon as we arrived, I had a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Our tents were undisturbed and nothing seemed out of place, apart from the fact that my brother was missing. I found his line and gear on the banks of the river, and slowly, panic started creeping in. We searched high and low, well into the night, using our flashlights. Just as we were about to give up and call the authorities, we heard yelling coming from the river. We scrambled down the mountain and past the tents, then skidded to a stop when we saw something emerging from the water. At first, it looked like a mud monster staggering out from the water and then falling to its knees. But then my brother's voice groaned loudly, and we knew that it was him. I yelled to my wife to get a blanket while I ran over to my brother. That's when I noticed that he was completely naked. He was covered in mud, but when I told him to go with me to the river to wash it off, he screamed no. My wife and I looked at each other, not knowing what had happened, as he wouldn't speak after that. We wrapped him in the blanket and sat him in front of the fire. It took a while before he told us what had happened. We had left to go hiking, and he'd started setting up to fish when he heard something in the middle of the river, like a gurgling sound. Thinking it was either a drowning animal or a freak whirlpool, he put on his waders and made his way into the water. He said that the last thing that he remembered was being dragged under. While we listened to his story, he began to shudder and shake his head, like he was trying to shake off a terrible memory. When we pressed him to go on, he finally blurted that he had been attacked by a monster. My wife and I looked at each other, obviously thinking the same thing, that he was hallucinating. We gave him a warm cup of cocoa, and soon he fell asleep. The next morning, I was able to take him to the edge of the river to wash the mud off. My blood froze when I saw his body. It was covered in horrible scratches, gouges, and bite marks. He looked like he was covered in bizarre markings. There were strange circular rashes on his torso, which he explained while sobbing that they were marks left by the monster's tentacles. There were strange scratches up and down his legs, like he'd been hit repeatedly with a whip, and many deep cuts. The freakiest wounds were the bite marks, which looked more like he'd been bitten by large bird beaks. As we cleaned him up and administered first aid, we heard a strange, gurgling, bubbling sound coming from the river. Sean started screaming and racing up the mountain before he even got dressed. I jumped up and started packing our gear without even checking out the creepy sounds. I told my wife we weren't waiting to find out what that was. Let's go. It wasn't long before we caught up to my brother, and we're back to safety. All three of us still don't have the guts to go back and figure out what happened that day, or what unholy creature lives in that river. This is something that happened to my great-granddad, and he swears that it's true. A quick bit of background. My great-granddad lived in a very remote village in Pakistan, where they had no electricity, no TV, no proper schools, so really no exposure to the outside culture. Their stories of the kings and queens featured a comedian and never a clown. I'll tell you why this is relevant shortly. His routine involved waking up really early in the morning, before sunrise, to go to the fields early enough, as most people in the village back then could only travel by walking or on a camel. So this one morning, he woke up and, after breakfast, left the house when it was still dark. Since there were no street lights back then, all he had was a lantern for light, which he held in one hand, and walked, looking down to avoid stepping on a snake. The village is in a desert, so finding snakes is quite common. Because it was quite early, the streets were completely deserted. Anyway, he had barely made it to the middle of his street when he heard the sound of bells ahead of him. It made him lift his lantern a bit higher and look up. According to him, as his eyes traveled up from the ground, he noticed a pair of feet wearing bright orange and red striped shoes with curved toes and bells on the ends. He continued looking up and saw a pair of legs, a torso, arms, and a head, covered from head to toe in the same orange and red striped outfit with ruffles around the neck and sleeves. My great-granddad noticed that on the head, this being was wearing a hat that had 3 pointy ends, with bells on each end. But there was no face, just a black mass where the face should have been. As soon as my great-granddad looked at this thing's face, it literally disappeared right in front of him. He ran back home and was freaked out for days after that. Now I need to remind everyone again that my great-granddad had never even heard of what a clown looked like. His description was so accurate that I instantly asked, "Did it look like a clown?" And he said, "I don't know what a clown is or looks like." It might sound strange to some people, but the village my great-granddad lived in is still way behind the times. The concept of Joker or clowns in a circus or birthday parties is still pretty much foreign to them. I know that a lot of people, including me before I heard this story from my great-granddad, have a phobia of clowns. A lot of the time we try to explain the fear saying things like, "It's because you can't see what's under the makeup," or "Some clowns have a sinister look about them." But for someone who had never even heard of a clown, seeing one in such clear, vivid detail is incredible, and I'm kind of starting to believe that maybe the fear of clowns isn't just because they look weird. Maybe it's because the concept of clowns did come from something paranormal. My parents own a small cabin in the middle of the woods on about 60 acres of land in upstate New York. Rural Sullivan County, to be a bit more precise. We call it, rather appropriately, the camp. The small cabin at the camp is nicely nestled in the middle of the woods. There's a mile-long dirt road also surrounded by woods that leads to a small dirt lot and a small yard in front of the building. We use this road to get to and from the camp. Behind the cabin is a clearing that's about 350 yards long and about 60 yards wide. The clearing consists of the backyard, the garden at the end of the yard, and a small field directly behind the garden. Other than that, the rest of the property is all woods. Woods that we've explored thoroughly, but a vast amount of woods nonetheless. The cabin is made up of only 2 rooms, with one room used as the bedroom and the other room used as the living area. There's only one wall inside the cabin, its purpose solely being to divide the two rooms. Other than that, the two rooms are completely open. The cabin had simple furnishings. In the bedroom there was a bunk bed and a sofa couch. In the living area, there was a love seat and a sofa couch, a wood stove, two dressers, a coffee table, a rocking chair, and a small TV. That's it. No kitchen, no bathroom. We used a gas-powered generator to run the few lights and outlets within the cabin, as well as the TV. We had a VCR hooked up to the TV and would occasionally watch movies on VHS or DVD. For those concerned about the bathroom situation, there was an outhouse about 30 yards from the cabin. To cook, we either used the wood stove inside the cabin or the propane grill on the small porch overlooking the backyard. The cabin has multiple windows. There's a fair-sized window that allows us to view the front yard, another fair-sized window on the side of the building that gives us a view of the woods, and a large picture window at the rear of the cabin that gives us a view of the backyard, garden, and field. These windows are all in the living area. There are two small windows in the other room of the cabin, but they're not relevant. Myself, my younger brother by about 3 years, and my mother and father spent just about every weekend at the camp when we were younger. Simply put, we grew up in the woods and were certainly no strangers to the outdoors. With that being said, I've had my share of experiences, most of which have had logical explanations. However, the event I'm about to share really stands out because, to this day, not one of us can explain it. This took place in the summer of 2008. I was 9 years old at the time. It was a perfectly normal Saturday in June. My brother and I carried out our normal routine of riding four-wheelers, playing outside, catching frogs and salamanders. Nothing out of the ordinary throughout the day, as you would expect. Towards the evening, it started to get chilly, so my little brother and I decided to call it a day and head inside the cabin for the night. I gasped up and started the generator, and we went inside for the evening. Once inside, I filled the wood stove and started the fire to get some heat going, as it was going to be a rather chilly night. My dad had just finished grilling the usual, chicken, potatoes, and burgers, and he brought the food inside around 7 p.m. We all ate and relaxed for a little while to let our food settle. The sun had just started to set. Fast forward about 30 minutes and I began to get bored. My mother then reminded me that she had brought my plug-and-play Wheel of Fortune game with us for us to play. I excitedly went ahead and plugged the RCA cables into the TV and set up the game. The TV was situated just to the left of the big picture window at the rear of the building. It was dusk at this point. By dusk, I mean it was getting darker, but there was still plenty of light to see outside. It was about 8 p.m. at this point, and in upstate New York, it isn't pitch black outside until around 9:30 p.m. in the middle of summer. So there was still plenty of light outside. We'd been playing Wheel of Fortune for a few minutes at this point. I was sat just a few feet away from the TV in a rocking chair. My mother handed me the game back for my turn when it happened. Just as I spun the wheel of the game, this extremely bright purple flash of light emitted from behind me at the front of the building. I turned my whole body around to see what it was and noticed that my parents and brother had done the same. I immediately noticed that the front yard was engulfed in this extremely bright purple light. We all watched as this purple light moved through the front window of the cabin. Once inside, it completely lit up the interior of the building. We all sat motionless, moving nothing but our heads as this mysterious bright purple light passed by us, then proceeded out the back picture window and into the backyard, lighting up everything in its path. The light then sped off through the yard towards the garden. We watched it pass through the garden, then through the field, and just like that, it disappeared into the woods. This all transpired within just a few seconds. I dropped the game as I was in shock. I turned around towards my parents and, already knowing the answer, nervously asked, "Did you see that?" They nodded and said yes in unison. My little brother ran over to the sofa my parents were sat on and quickly sat between them. I quickly followed his lead. In the hours that followed, nothing else happened that was out of the ordinary. It seems so pointless and ungrateful for me to complain about what most people would say is nuts, but I have a theory that my 15-year-old son isn't my son. I'm not saying that I think he was either switched at birth or that my wife cheated on me back then, but he and I don't click at all. Don't get me wrong. He looks like me, sounds like me, and even acts like me at times, especially when he's angry or finds something amusing. People are always praising my wife and I for raising such a perfect, well-mannered, intelligent, and good-looking boy who cares about the world and all the creatures, great and small. But if you ask me, he's a little too perfect. Even when he loses his temper, he's thoughtful and soon apologizes. Some would say that we have a perfect life. We're well off and we live in a beautiful home which is taken care of by my wonderful wife. Some say we're so lucky that it hurts. But I'd give anything to have what other people have, even if it meant being poorer. I enjoy seeing the trials and tribulations of others. That's what life is supposed to be all about, but my wife just doesn't agree. She loves how perfect her little angel is, and goes on and on about how wonderful he is. It makes me want to vomit and scream. The only time she ever lost her temper was 6 months ago when I told her about a vivid dream I had had. It started with my son being a year old again. I went into his room and saw the window open, with the curtains flying and flapping about. I went over close to the window when I felt the hairs on my neck tickle. I slowly turned around and saw an evil-looking shadow person leaning over the crib. My instincts kicked in and I raced over to the crib, but the creature grabbed my son up and leapt out of the window. I yelled for my wife as I ran down the stairs to apprehend the creature as my son screamed in terror. When I made it outside, she came up behind me with our son on her hip. Both were smiling sweetly at me. After that dream, I woke up crying and saying that I finally knew what happened to our son, and that we'd been left with a changeling from the other side. My wife was so enraged she slapped me across the face. She was so hurt that she began to cry. I comforted her and tried to shake the dream off. I'll never forget the next morning at breakfast. My son gave me the strangest smile He said, "I love you, Father." You know that, right? I gulped and nearly choked on my coffee because I was so chilled by the undertone of his trained voice. "Yeah, I know that, Daniel. I love you too." I watched as he stared right through me with his pale green eyes, before he looked back at his eggs with a satisfied smile. Just yesterday, we went to a crazy New Age festival, which my wife loves to attend. She and Daniel put on crazy hats and danced with the other nuts while I sipped some god-awful herbal smoothie. I nearly choked when I saw a boy watching me from the other side of the field. Something about his eyes and the wistful way he looked at me pulled at my heartstrings. I started to move towards him, but in an instant he was gone. I could have sworn I saw a dark figure leading him away. I was then distracted by Daniel, who gave me an almost threatening look. "Father, aren't you going to join in?" he asked in a menacing tone. When I saw the pained look in my wife's eyes, I gave in and took his hand. "Sure," I smiled. I keep telling myself, someday soon. One of the most difficult elements of being a landlord is dealing with unruly tenants who don't pay the rent. It's more frustrating when they leave without warning, leaving behind a huge mess that'll take ages to clean up. What happened to me was far worse than any of that, and more like one of those terrifying ghost stories you hear about. My property was in a good neighborhood and in good condition, so when I realized they'd fled, I was concerned. They'd lived in the house for over 8 months and had paid the rent on time, right up until they took off. When I got a call from one of the neighbors telling me they heard strange noises, I went over to investigate. From the outside, the place looked fine, but when I got inside, I nearly threw up. The filth and stench was awful. It seemed as though they deliberately let the place go, but I felt there was something more sinister going on. I tried not to get emotional as I walked around and surveyed the wreckage. Then I heard a sloshing sound coming from upstairs. I knew I had to go upstairs, and even though the electricity was still connected, I took my time to get there. The strange sloshing sounds grew louder with each step. As I approached the top of the stairs, I also heard moaning. I wasn't sure if the voice was a human, the air conditioning, the plumbing, or even an animal. Turned out, it was none of those. Although I didn't know it at the time, I had a hunch that I was about to come across something not of this earth. For some unknown reason, I kept going, even though I was trembling and shuddering while my legs went to jelly. As soon as I put my hand on the bathroom door handle, the sloshing and moaning stopped. I opened the door. What happened next was so surreal, I was sure that I was in the middle of a nightmare. The light flickered as my eyes were distracted by the terrible grime and mold that had taken over. At first, I didn't see the woman peering over the edge of the bath. But then I saw the black holes where her eyes were supposed to be. Scared stiff, I could only watch as she slapped a wet hand over the edge and onto the floor. Her long, dark, tangled hair clung to her twisted body. Her skin was almost translucent and streaked with blood. I have no problem telling you that I was shaking in my boots. Then the other hand hit the floor and I jumped. Her face was trained on me as she hoisted herself up and over the rim of the tub, while the moaning started again. The sensible side of me tried to rationalize the scene as a drug addict who'd been squatting on my property. That's when I asked in a shaky voice, "Can I help you?" I regretted those words as her face became more grotesque. To this day, I can't believe what I saw next. Her face opened up like a flip-top trash can as the top jaw spread backwards. It looked like she was turning inside out as she slithered towards me. I screamed and turned around and raced off as fast as I could. Then the police arrived. They never found the slithering monster and probably thought I was crazy. I wish that was the case, as it would have been far easier to believe. There are things that happen in everyday life that we're unable to explain. Images, sounds, and movements that frighten our psyche and make us question if what we witnessed actually happened or if it was just part of our imaginations. One of these events happened to me last month. I live in California in the San Francisco Bay Area. I like to take frequent hikes through the trails close to my apartment. I've always had this fascination with nature. It's always been a personal hobby of mine. I love taking in landscapes of forests, absorbing the peaceful environment around me. Usually I take walks with friends who share my passion, but oftentimes I feel like they can slow me down. A lot of my buddies aren't in the best physical shape, so they can often complain and move kind of slowly. On this particular day, I got home from work around 5 and decided to take a hike by myself. I set off on the trail a little later. It was cool outside, so I decided to jog the hike, which was about 4 miles in length. I passed by a few other people on the trail, but not many. There didn't seem to be a lot of people hiking this day. As I neared the end of the first pass, it started to get a little darker out, and I stopped seeing anyone on the trail. For some reason, even though I didn't see anybody, I got the eerie sense that I was being followed by something. So I started to quicken my pace. After the halfway point, dusk was upon me, and out of nowhere, it started to get foggy out. The air around me started to turn into a dark, gray haze. At first, it was just a thin layer, but as my hike continued, it started to get so bad that I couldn't see 6 feet in front of me. My heart rate started jacking up with the feeling of something still following me through the fog. I wanted to turn around to convince myself that I was imagining things, but I was too afraid to stop. Sick of feeling paranoid, I came to a sudden stop. I turned around, and there through the haze was a woman standing a few yards away from me. I knew there was no one else on the trail as I didn't pass anybody after the halfway point. Panicking, I started running as fast as I could back to my car. I looked back again, and the woman was still the same distance away. She just stood there, looking right through me. I just kept running, hoping to get away from the mysterious figure. My heart was pounding. Sweat was dripping from my forehead as I breathed heavy. I was about to have a full-on panic attack until I noticed the fog slowly disappearing from around me. I looked back and the mysterious woman had vanished. I kept running quickly until I got to the end of the trail, finally reaching my car. Ever since that day, I've been too afraid to take hikes alone. That was 1 month ago. I've tried to replay the events in my head, hoping to convince myself that I'm not crazy. I don't know what the mysterious figure in the fog wanted, but I feel in my bones that I barely escaped with my life that day. Getting your tonsils out isn't exactly a nightmare, unless you're already afraid of hospitals or blood. At the age of 11, I was afraid of both, notwithstanding real scary stories, one of which happened to me. After 3 years of recurring bouts of tonsillitis, I was admitted to the hospital amid promises of ice cream and Jell-O. I awoke in the recovery ward, completely alone and still drowsy, wondering where the nurses were. Hearing a noise at the other end of the ward, I turned my head, only to see a silhouette in the shadows. I could make out the figure of a woman, seemingly dressed as a nurse, but there was something strange about her. Before I could gesture to get her attention, she slowly turned and started creeping towards me. I felt the chill in the air as she approached, with her hands outstretched, murmuring quietly to herself. It wasn't until she reached my side and looked down at me when I realized she didn't have eyes at all. There were strange markings all over her face, like she'd been decorated with war paint or streaks of blood. I tried to scream, but my throat was so sore. I thrashed about as she bent down, her face only inches away from mine. I thought my life was over. I could smell the blood and saw that the streaks were still fresh, but something else came to mind. She seemed to be a native or tribal warrior, but what tribe or what place? Hell, I couldn't be sure. What chilled me to the bone was the fact that there seemed to be eyeballs moving under her skin. With one last thrash, the lights suddenly came on and she was gone. A real nurse came over to me and admonished me for thrashing around, telling me to get some sleep. I tried to tell her about the nurse from the shadows, but before I knew it, my own eyes were closing up. Not realizing that I'd been given a sedative, I slipped into what I thought would be a welcome sleep. It wasn't until I came to, standing at the foot of my bed, when it dawned on me that I was now the shadow nurse. I could just make out the shape of the bed and heard my own muffled screams coming from my sore throat. What was stranger still was that I now had the perspective of the shadow nurse, and I knew what she wanted. I could feel the blood drying on my face and felt the eyeballs rolling around, desperately trying to see. A curse had been placed on me, and I knew I had to take control of this young body in order to break the spell. As I leaned over my own body, I was afraid for my own endangered life, yet I felt the nurse's need to escape. Just as I felt my new persona filtered towards my writhing body on the bed, the lights came on again. In a flash, I was back in my body, sitting completely upright and looking everywhere for that nurse in the shadows. I slept with the light on from that day forward. I never saw her again.